ambidexterity is about three things, right? And I think we way overcomplicate this. It's about ambition. What is the strategic ambition of the industry? I can talk more about what I mean by that. Secondly, can you give autonomy to the explorer so it can operate with this different logic? And then how does it maintain access to the assets of the core business?
This episode is brought to you by WHU, the Otto Beisheim School of Management. WHU is reshaping the way students learn about business, management, finance, and entrepreneurship through its innovative programs and partnerships in Germany and across the globe. To learn more about this globally ranked university, visit whu.edu today.
Well, hello folks, Gerrit here. Let's begin this episode of the Most Awesome Founder podcast by welcoming back my partner in crime, Professor Dries Foms, Chair of Entrepreneurship, Innovation, and Technological Transformation at WHU. Always a pleasure to co-host with you, Dries.
Hi, Gerrit. It's great to be here again.
It is good to see you once again, my friend. So today, Dries and I are welcoming a fascinating guest and an unquestioned thought leader in the fields of innovation, venture incubation, organizational ambidexterity, and much more, Mr. Andy Binns. Andy's CV is really as impressive as it comes. He's the co-founder of an innovation advisory firm called ChangeLogic, where he's advised senior leadership of some of the world's greatest companies. He's a fellow at the Center of Future Organization at the Drucker School of Management, and he's a member of the executive board of Fast Company. And he's also a co-author of some of the most significant innovation publications of this century, including Corporate Explorer, 3 Disciplines of Innovation, Ambidextrous CEO, and many, many more, too many to list in this little monologue. But rather than me continuing to butcher Andy's credentials any more than I already have, I will pass the baton to the man himself to tell his story.
Coming to you from WHU on the banks of the Rhine River in beautiful Vallendar, Germany. This is the best and most awesome founder podcast. A show about entrepreneurs, innovators, advisors, and educators, and the stories that make them who they are today.
Andy, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Great. I'm delighted. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be with you and your listeners. Yeah. So my sort of world was initially one of bouncing around, as many others do. I actually went to graduate school in New York and studied political philosophy. And then at some point, my first commercial thought was, geez, there's not much market in the world for political philosophy. It turns out we've really probably got enough thinkers out there already. And so maybe I don't need to do that. And I kind of got bored with the way that all of my professors hadn't read anything in a decade. And I'm like, started to doubt the value of what I had. And so I bounced around a bunch of other sort of marketing roles, ending up in consulting and at McKinsey. And at McKinsey, my role was very much around organizational change projects. McKinsey, has traditionally, and I think still, focused on analytical strategy problems. I was much more focused on human problems at that stage in my career, and so I would get involved whenever there was, as there really always was, a significant shift in terms of a senior team or organizational shift or something of that nature. And then one day somebody walked into my office with this thing called the McKinsey Growth Practice, and they'd just written this book on the alchemy of growth. And this chap, Sajal Kohli, who I think now is a partner at McKinsey, or director potentially. And Sajal told me about what they were trying to do to help corporations manage the need to balance short-term with long-term. And how could they work with clients to do that? Because they'd figured out already that the traditional McKinsey model of go give them the answer wasn't working. There was something more fundamental happening inside the organization that was kind of getting in the way. And so as it happens, I left McKinsey just shortly after this and went to IBM, and I had this really special role supporting senior leaders in IBM. And it was a very small sort of internal consulting group. I didn't really understand perhaps just how special it was, but I then had 5 happy years at IBM, and I got drafted into to work with what was called the emerging business opportunities. And I went, wait a minute, that's what Sajal was telling me about, and we're doing it here. Well, that's cool. And so I got lucky, basically, of entering into the exact thing that I was really curious about, which is how do we wrestle with the question of renewal and innovation inside large, established, successful organizations. And this little moment at IBM was one where they created some billion-dollar businesses, 2000 to 2007. And so I got also to see some success. And I'm not saying that success was mine or attributable to me. I got to be a part of that. And I learned a ton from that. And one of the things that happened is we brought in these 2 business school professors, Mike Tushman from the Harvard Business School, Charles O'Reilly from Stanford. And they had sort of developed a method for working at organizations to help surface some of these barriers to change and innovation. And we applied this like relentlessly with team after team at IBM over 5 years. And particularly with these emerging business opportunities. And so I saw this work, I saw how this integral connection between innovation and change was happening at IBM. And so, cut a long story fast, there was a little episode in between, which we can talk about if we really want life to get ugly. But eventually I said, well, hey guys, why don't we set up a business? So standing on the banks of the River Thames in London underneath an umbrella with Mike Tushman one day in 2007, we hatched the plan to create what's now called Change Logic. And we've been running this firm for 15 years, working with a bunch of different organizations, helping them do essentially what we did at IBM, but we've learned a lot since then. and people have told us, people like Steve Blank, like Ron Adner, which I understand some of your recent guests, we've learned all of their, lessons, well, not all of their lessons, we've learned from them, we've learned from others. It's not a case where, at IBM, we had the magic fairy dust and everything else is golden. It was a good experience, but it's a constant learning process.
Great. And maybe because you recently wrote a book together with your 2 friends in crime,
thank you.
The Corporate Explorer. And when I started reading the book, I was really triggered by kind of the provocative assumption that you seem to have, because I think most people, today, and maybe that's really influenced by the work of Christensen, the Innovator's Dilemma. I think a lot of people have the assumption that large established corporates are likely to become the victim of disruption. And you make the claim actually quite quickly in your book that actually corporates can be the driver of disruption, which, to be honest, I found a quite provocative statement. So can you explain a bit more how you came to that insight?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? We do have this strong assumption that, with strong assumption there's only one story. And there's never only one story. The world is wildly more complex and much more diversity than one story. Yeah. And so, I in no way dispute Christensen's fundamental analysis that disruption exists in the world, and there's a bunch of very successful firms that lose with incredible speed, lose their position, and they're ejected. And there's also no question that startups are a vital source of innovation and creativity and energy and momentum inside an economy. I think that these things can both be true. And the other thing that can be true is that there's some corporates who are really successful. And I could go to what I think are some well-known examples, like Microsoft. Microsoft 2010, everybody had a script about them, which is they're going to lose to Google. That Gmail and Google Docs are going to defeat its desktop installed software. And there was even a quarter where they lost money as a corporation, right? This is like extraordinary. But that's not what happened. And it's not, this transformation was not Satya Nadella, right? This all started before Satya Nadella under a leader called Chi Lu, who was responsible for the application services group. And what Chi Lu did is he separated out his existing Office desktop business under Julie Larson Green from his business for Office 365 in the Exchange, moving the Exchange server to the cloud under another gentleman whose name has temporarily escaped me, right? And then they developed both of these business models side by side, right? And then eventually 365 took over. So they sort of self-disrupted in this way. And this is a more common story than we realize. And what's interesting is that doesn't make the headlines like unicorn, lists on the NASDAQ, yet another unicorn from your fine institution, right? That's a great story, and we should celebrate it. But that doesn't mean that these other stories aren't happening. And they're pretty extraordinary. We wanted to explore that, explain why it happens, and indeed how you can make it happen more often.
Yeah.
And Andy, a quick question on that one, which is, and maybe I'm stealing a little bit from kind of Steve Blank's perspective on this, which is, well, I guess taking it back a step and saying, what is disruption? And, you're a McKinsey guy, thinking of the kind of 3 horizons of innovation. I think it sounds to me like, using the Microsoft example, maybe that's kind of horizon 1 innovation. Do you believe this holds true up into like the new market creation levels of horizon 3 innovation? Or is this more the incremental in the context where you're chasing market share?
Yeah, so I think honestly you're miscoding Microsoft. So the key thing about disruption is, what is the industry standard at the time, and are you changing it? The taxi industry in the world had a set of rules about how it operated. Uber came along and changed it. The razor blade industry, think about here's Gillette trying to worry about whether they can add a 4th blade, and Dollar Shave Club comes along and says, well, guys, actually, we're going to reinvent the entire way you sell and serve. That's a change in the standard. And from the point of view of Microsoft, moving from a desktop install business to a cloud business has dramatic shifts. They also moved to a monthly subscription model, right? So rather than their main source of profits coming from enterprise licenses in the way that it was traditionally, they move over to this subscription model, and that changes all of their supplier relationships. And so they have to convince, firstly, their customers are CIOs who earn their living by managing the server farms that have the Exchange servers on. They're going to move those to the cloud, and they're going to take their partners with them. And they've got to think about a different way of doing customer service in this model as well, because the sort of the way that they're provisioning clients is different. And so this was a change of standard, just the same as Dollar Shave Club. And this is one of the things, is that we too easily miss how dramatic some of these shifts are with that corporations achieve. But it's not just that. You can go to a great example the story we tell in Corporate Explorer is the story of LexisNexis, right? And LexisNexis is an established corporation. In its day, when it was founded in the 70s, it was a revolution. Dial-up access to case law. Apparently, they kept the Supreme Court for a 30-minute meeting. It went 9 hours as they were dialing up on a modem to get case law. They were so thrilled by this experience, right? Fast forward to 2000, and this chap, Jim Peck, says, hey, we've got some really important data assets that if we could just figure out how to connect with other assets, get some linking database software, hey, we could have a whole new business. And we create a category called risk data analytics, or big data, right? We don't know of the startup who did that, because LexisNexis did it from under their noses, right? And it's now a bigger business than the original legal online information. And so these stories are just not as easy to pass. They're not as, eye-catching. They don't. The leaders who do them tend not to, frankly, have the same attention needs. It's a polite way of putting it, that some startup founders do. right? And I say that as a founder. I founded Change Logic, run it 15 years, and I've probably got those issues too. But it's that they tend not to be those characters, right? And so there's just stories that are hiding in plain sight that we don't know.
And in your book, you seem to emphasize that companies can only achieve this. So running their normal operational business that they have, and next to that, actually engaging in more fundamental change processes. And if you want to do that, you need to kind of separate it. What you call in the book ambidexterity or structural ambidexterity.
That's right.
Why is it so important to do this separation?
I think that the separation. So you're right. We talk about this notion of ambidexterity. It's like I've been working on this for 20 some years, and then all of a sudden the world has discovered ambidexterity and the ambidextrous organization. Mike has a former colleague from Columbia who has opposed this theory for years, and now suddenly is claiming it was part of her theory. I was like amazed at this recent article she published. It's astonishing. But anyway, but it's really great that people have and this chap Osterwalder is suddenly exploit this. Yeah, we published that some decades ago, man. We know this point, right? And the whole point about explore and exploit, or core and explore, I'd much prefer to call it, because exploit implies some sort of judgment, right? Mm-hmm. It's the old business, it's the tired business. It's also the profitable one. And hey, we like that money, right? And we like those jobs, we like that value, so on. So core and explore, they have a different logic. Core is working within a known world or knowable world in which there are certain rules that you can look at, and there's data of past performance, there's an established basis of competition, there's some way of, then there's not that change doesn't happen, but it's within a set of established boundaries. On the explore side, those boundaries have not been set, right? This is high uncertainty, high variation, right? And a standard hasn't been developed. It's in another language, it's the blue ocean, right? And you're kind of swimming around in the blue ocean. Now, if you're doing that and you see these two different logics, it's very difficult, if not impossible, for the core business to genuinely do the explore, right? Because they can't cope with that degree of uncertainty, that degree of variation. And so a lot of the failures of corporate innovation at the radical edge, not at the incremental, come about because you're trying to put that responsibility on the core business, and it just can't be done. And it's not because they're not good people, it's not because they're not smart or intelligent, it's just the logic makes it impossible to do. So you've got to separate, you've got to create some autonomy for the explore business so that they can operate within that logic, which is more incremental, and we should talk more about what that involves. But I think that's the core behind structural ambidexterity. And as an academic, Dries, you rightly prefix it with structural ambidexterity, because there are others who have a different view. And candidly, as a sort of slight academic, but mostly a practitioner, advisor, I don't understand this. The people who advocate ambidexterity as a mental, thinking, cognitive activity. I don't get that. Or contextual ambidexterity is the other one, right? Yeah. And it was always held up that Google was our great example of contextual ambidexterity, which means you give every person the opportunity to experiment within their day-to-day job. Well, guess what? Google is still struggling. Google X still didn't make it, and they have more failures in their innovation story than successes, because it's really tough to do.
Yeah, maybe to give you a bit pushback. So I see your logic for separation, but I sometimes also see that within companies that can trigger a situation where you can create what I would call kind of isolated islands. So separate places far from the headquarters where apparently fancy stuff is going on, but nobody else within the organization understands that. They seem to be very independent, but then in the end, their ability to actually have an impact on the business seems to be quite limited.
Yeah, and so there's some sort of index we should create, Dries, about success of a corporate innovation unit and sort of spend on office furniture, ping pong tables, and so on, right? You know, and I once advised this U.S. defense company. We were helping them think about how they set up an innovation unit, and they were just obsessed with the interior decoration. And you're like, guys, that is not the point. That is not the point. And so the ambidexterity is about three things, right? And I think we way overcomplicate this. It's about ambition. What is the strategic ambition of the industry? And talk more about what I mean by that. Secondly, can you give autonomy to the explorer so it can operate with this different logic? And then how does it maintain access to the assets of the core business? And that's got to be for three reasons. That access is about, firstly, leveraging those assets to go faster than a startup. That's kind of the point, right? Secondly, so that it can find what one of my clients calls a happy home, right? Because sometimes it's going to come back into the business unit rather than be a separate thing. And then thirdly, it's going to teach you, right? Especially in the digital age, it's bringing capabilities that we want to help enhance our abilities, even in the core business. So for these three reasons, I totally agree with you, Dries. You should never, I don't think never is a very strong word. I find it very difficult to understand why you would think of an innovation unit as this completely separate thing. And I've got and we can go on and talk about my stance on entrepreneurs in residence, which is not overly warm, right, because of this problem.
Yeah, maybe can you touch a bit, because indeed I read in your book you were saying somewhere, if you think about managers for this kind of exploration, these are not the prototypical entrepreneurs. These are not the Garrett McGowans that we need in that place. We need other ones. Can you explain a bit why? And then Garrett can react.
So this is I agree completely, Dries, and it's something that we've done a little research on. We published an obscure article a bunch of years ago on this about. We looked at I forget how many, 30 or 40 different what we now call corporate explorers, and tried to look at their innovation, their background, and their success. And what became incredibly clear was that there was a strong correlation between failure and being appointed from the outside, right? And that that got us curious as to, well, why is that? Right. And it became almost comic, because when we would go back to interview some of the people in our research sample, what we found is they'd already left the company that they were in. Right. And it's pretty simple. And it was summed up by a former friend of mine at McKinsey. She was with a bank, and she was also an entrepreneur. She's a restaurateur. Her husband and her created restaurants in Chicago, and she gets appointed to create a new credit card business in another bank. It's for various reasons. It's an explore piece for them, different business model, blah blah blah. And she says, in the first 6 months, they were so helpful, they were so friendly, and so pleased that I was there. When I actually started to do something, all of that help disappeared, and so that by the end of it, it was like trying to paddle up the Amazon with a butter knife. Right? There's no interest in helping. And she didn't know how things got done. She had no relationships to draw on, right? There's no social capital. The business didn't know what her performance track record was. That's a really critical thing. So you can't isolate the factors in your decision about, well, is this just another bump on the road of experimentation, or is this actually to do with this individual? I had this exact situation turn up with a unicorn, a business just went public, and the CEO and founding team spent a few hours with us because they were trying to create a new business, right? And they said, we created this new venture. We hired this leader in from outside. She seemed fantastic, but after 2 years, we've gone nowhere, and we think it's her, because implicit assumption, it couldn't possibly be us, right? And we talked to her, and you can see there was a little bit that was her, but a lot of it was them, right? And so this is the trouble. The outsiders lack everything that they need to get success. It doesn't mean that they can't succeed, and we can talk about one in particular that I think will succeed. But it's stacked against them.
I guess Dries is waiting for my position on this. Well, I mean, Andy, I have been a startup guy for 20 years. I've never had a job where I didn't sign my own paycheck. So I really know very little about what it would be like to work in a big corporate. I have built an enterprise SaaS company where I had corporates as clients, and now I run a corporate venture studio where we build ventures in co-investment roles with corporates. So I'm relatively new to this game, but what I can say from my limited experience is that, in my opinion, it kind of takes two to tango, right? You almost need the entrepreneurial energy and speed and I think there's some characteristics that come with entrepreneurs that maybe they don't necessarily, it's not that they don't exist in people that work in corporates, but the systems and the structures in which they operate may kind of quell them a little bit. But in the same breath, you need the people that know how to navigate those relationships, those structures, understanding what is sometimes conflicting objectives across business units. So we're building multiple ventures right now with some of the biggest companies in the world, and I can say the partnerships where we have a corporate partner and internal champions that are getting those, helping to unlock those unfair advantages that the corporates have, are leading to successful ventures that we're follow-up financing. The ones that there isn't someone that's able to navigate the hierarchies, the bureaucracies, the relationships to unlock those assets, they tend to go nowhere. But I will say, the reason we're actually building ventures with these companies is because almost every one of them have tried to go at it on their own. They've built their CVC, they've built their internal accelerator that ended up crashing and burning, or their Skunk Works project, and even their M&A with the recent years of high valuations they're not able to even acquire. So they've been looking for new ways to be able to drive bigger innovation. So in the end, I think there's a role for both, right?
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I love what you're doing. It's an awesome approach, and it's really about a both and if I have one sort of message that I Dries, whether you get it from the book, but it's like we cannot be dogmatic or religious about any of this, and if you go back sort of maybe 10 years to the CVC crowd, they would say, oh, we don't need to do any of this stuff. You just, we'll just make the investment and then we'll buy them later. Well, that didn't work, right? It works occasionally, but and I think so. So the thing is not to be dogmatic about any one approach. I mean, it was only 10 years ago when the lean startup changed everything. Remember Steve's article in HBR, and Steve himself said, well, that didn't work, right? So we just need to be extremely careful about fads. And it doesn't mean there isn't value in lean startup. There sure as hell is, right? And there's a huge value in Steve's work, but it doesn't mean that it's the answer, that it's the fairy dust. And I think we just got to get used to the reality that it requires a set of different approaches and tactics to pull this off.
Maybe to touch a bit further on this aspect of what kind of people do you need to lead this kind of corporate exploration? Because I think that's a very fascinating question, and I see a lot of companies struggle with it. And so you were saying before, if you ask me, and again, we need to generalize here a bit, but most of the time an outsider is not the right choice. So you would say an insider, but when I read your book, I also had the feeling that you really have a feeling that there's a kind of new generation of leaders and managers necessary to pull off what it takes for corporate exploration. Can you maybe explain a bit more what kind of people you have in your mind when you talk about successful managers?
So a couple of things. I mean, firstly, I think corporate explorers have always been there, right? Where did the ATM machine come from? Do you know? It wasn't a startup. The ATM machine was first launched in Barclays Bank in the UK in 1963, an innovation of the De La Rue Corporation. Do you know how old the De La Rue Corporation is? It's now over 300 years old, right? And this guy had an idea, hey, and it prints money, it prints currency for countries around the world, right? So, and he had an idea, he managed to get a client, a company engaged with it, he used some of the assets of De La Rue, he got it out into the market, right? So the reality of corporate explorers is that they've been around, we just don't herald them or see them as much, and it's not as easy to isolate them as it is other factors of a business. However, I do think there's sort of a tipping point as well. And I think that we've moved where corporate explorers were an emerging thing. When I was at IBM, and I talk about this in Corporate Explorer, Carol Kovac, who built this IBM life sciences business. Carol's a corporate explorer. We didn't call her that. There was some sense in which she saw herself as being entrepreneurial, and she was always a little bit of an outsider. Right, and that's a little bit of a characteristic of many corporate explorers. They're the people who make you a little uncomfortable, right, and who are often seen as railing against the way things are and pointing out the future and trying to get people to change. And that was very much Carol. But they're also passionate. They see something in the world that they want to change. This is the same as your entrepreneur, right? And so if you go and look at Amy Wilkinson's book, The Creator's Code, and Amy lists a whole bunch of different aspects of what she did a big research on entrepreneurs. And this first one about the sort of the passion to solve a customer problem, this is exactly the same, right? And this first came into focus with me sitting and talking to this guy Christian Kurtisch at the Austrian insurance company Unica, and Christian I knew was building this business which he calls Share Risk, which is now scaling across. It's in Germany, it's in a number of Eastern European countries as well, and this was something that he observed. He was frustrated that the insurance industry had lost its way, it lost sight of being a risk-sharing community and become a policy administration machine trying to detect fraud from its customers, right? And he's like, how do I reinvent that sense of community and do so for the digital age, right? We could talk more about how he did that. But the point is he had this passion. And that again is something that you see. The other side of it is that there's humility, and this is where, as I indicated earlier, they may be different. Christian, to a degree, Carol, maybe a little less. She's a little bit different, but she was a deep part of the sort of social network of IBM already. But it wasn't about them. It wasn't about their getting attention to them. Christian doesn't mind if other people think they made him successful. And as I did more interviews around the business, I would find that there were plenty of people who claimed credit for getting Christian started or helping him along the way. And he has this way of just kind of sucking you in to his journey, right? So you just want to see him succeed. I've seen this with another character at Analog Devices. His innovation is still in stealth mode, so I'm not going to talk about who he is or what he does. But Venu is his name, and he just builds people around him. He's got an infectious enthusiasm for building something, and so one of the things this does is it helps him create social capital in the organization. He's got people who are allies, who can unlock some of that resource that he might need to run an experiment. He's got some advocates who might intervene in a business review when he's being trashed for not having met a revenue number and explain the context of what's going on. And he's got a few ambassadors who will go talk to the people who remain blockers in the organization and help bring them on side when he needs to, right? And it's that kind of approach that's a little different. Now, for me, Gerrit, your experience may be different, but when I talk to startup founders, particularly ones who've done a few, they're managing a big list of stakeholders as well, right? And they're more external. But you get into several rounds of funding. That's an awful lot of firms who have a set of objectives that don't always line up with one another. You've got partners, you've got employees. There's a lot of stakeholders. So it is different to an entrepreneur, but it's not fundamentally unexpected. And I think maybe one of the flaws that we have is that some corporate managers believe this mythology that organizations are hierarchical, and that you just somebody's given me this role, I'm in a separate innovation unit, I should just be able to do this. Well, that's not the world. It's just not the world, right? There are interdependencies to manage, and it's the same everywhere. And these folks do that. So it's about passion, it's about humility, it's about being candidly a bit of a misfit, but they also have an explorer thing. There's this Dutch academic, Peter Robertson, who's done a lot of work on how you can look at individuals and teams in terms of what's their readiness to play at different points on an S curve, right? How agile are they to operate, and how fit are they to the job? And he profiles how exploratory people are, essentially, in their propensity to want to push boundaries. And this is a characteristic, again, of entrepreneurs or of the corporate explorers. And the thing is, every corporation has them at some point, and it's a matter of whether you use them or lose them.
I wanted to dig a little deeper on this topic. I find it super, super fascinating. And I agree on all accounts of what you said, that there are people within organizations, in large organizations, that have the same kind of ethos and mentality as entrepreneurs. I don't see them as diametrically opposed. But if I would outline one difference to the uninitiated, it would be what kind of freedom you get when you're building in the wild rather than building and experimenting within a structure. And entrepreneurship by default is hypothesis testing and experimentation. As a result, failure is deeply embedded in the process. As soon as you take the concept of failure and you put it in a more established organization where maybe failure isn't perceived the same way, risk profiles begin to change. How do you see organizations enabling environments of corporate exploration? Because I love this concept. I'm just trying to understand, I'm a CEO of a large company. How do I bring these people out of the woodwork and give them the platform to take risks?
Yeah, totally. So one thing I want to say is it failure? Is it actually failure we want? Do we really want to fail? Is that what you're saying? Or do we want to learn? And I think we want to learn. And I think this failure thing and this obsession with failure is potentially one of our challenges, because it triggers all the wrong psychological responses, right? It does in no way helpful to us. And so
language matters. Yeah.
And particularly in organizations, right? This is then this is what we've talked about. And so I think if we can pivot this to how do we learn, how do we experiment, and then indeed how do we, as you say, absolutely right, test hypotheses, right? And this does become challenging inside organizations. Firstly, there's a lack of skill at it, to actually isolate a testable hypothesis. Secondly, it's culturally, and we haven't talked a lot about culture, that's what you're highlighting. It's culturally sort of not expected, right? And so all culture is what do I think I need to do to be successful around here, right? And what I think I need to do to be successful in most corporations is I need to be certain and confident, not stand up and say, I don't know, which is basically what a hypothesis is. I don't know, but here's my best guess that I'm going to go test, right? And so this kind of understanding this cultural norm of wanting to have a point of view, test it, be willing to say I don't know, and to be driven more by the data than by gut instinct or by, because I'd say corporations think that that's what entrepreneurs are doing. It's all gut instinct, and then some of it is. I'm not against gut instinct, but it's not all of it, right? And so I think so there's this sort of need for capability and skill around experimentation, which is fundamental. But then how do you create a license to explore? And here I think this example of Ajay Banga at MasterCard is a really good one. He took over as CEO like 2010. And MasterCard basically, number 3 in their industry of credit card processing, right? It's quite a narrow part of the financial services industry. And he sets a strategic ambition. He says, I want to wage a war on cash and convert a high percentage of the 85% of people of transactions which are manual to digital. Now, he just did a few things with that statement, right? The first thing he did was he expanded the addressable market for MasterCard. He said, we're not in this little segment of credit card processing anymore. I want to go after everything that's involved in cash, and I want to replace it with digital. And he also triggered an emotional response, wage a war, right? A little bit of compelling sense of passion around it. And then he provided the tools and equipment to actually call forth the corporate explorers, right? He had a very disciplined approach to getting ideas from the organization. He had a lab structure for properly testing and experimenting with them. And then he knew how to go scale them in his business. And it led to them catching up and surpassing Visa and so on. And it's a really great story of doing this well. And so, whenever I talk to CEOs, I talk about how can they create a license to explore and then put some boundaries around it. Because one of the things that corporations also struggle with is their almost obsessive devotion to ideation, right? And they mistake creating ideas, generating new ideas, with getting them done. Well, it turns out you can't spend an idea. You want to spend a business, right? You want to spend a revenue. You want to actually see it scale. And so this obsession with ideas, which is partly a psychological thing, right? It's addictive. We just love possibilities. We love, imagining what if. And because resources are less constrained in organizations, you can do more excitement around the ideation than you'd get away with in a resource-constrained startup, right? And so what I then advocate to CEOs is you've got to put some boundaries around this. Have your hunting zones. Where is it that you're going to explore to realize that ambition? And make sure that if you're going to engage people in generating ideas, which I do believe in the need to do that, you do so with a much clearer focus and ask them, here are the customer problems we want to solve. What are your ideas for doing that? How could we build a business around doing this? And so on. That's much more likely to drive to success. So if you put all of that in place, then you can start to look for those corporate explorers that have the passion, have that ability to leverage the social network, have the right explorers behavior to come forward, and then you get into the laborious task of experimenting and incubating, and not spending too fast, right? Because again, you want to. One guy I was with at this conference this week said you got to spend pocket money, right? And that's very tough for a corporation, because they love being serious. If we're serious about innovation, we should spend some money, right? And of course, that's just not true. You've got to keep it lean for a period of time until you've got through that phase. So this is another cultural challenge that we face.
Because I think that's also interesting in your book. So you have a nice chapter where you explain how can corporates do this ideation, this incubation, where you actually explain this is the toolbox that we have, and it's very similar to the lean startup approach. It's about hypothesis testing, blah, blah, blah. But I think you also then say at the end of the chapter, the beginning of that chapter, but this is not the most difficult part. Yes. The more difficult part is then the scaling. So if you have generated ideas, in the end, you need to scale them. And that's actually, at least as I understood it from your book, that's when the going gets tough, because then money has to be put on the table and you need to come to a scalable business.
That's right.
What are the kind of best practices for corporates to go into scaling?
Yeah. So thanks, Teresa, for pointing that out, because and my Harvard colleague Mike, he likes to wind me up by saying ideation and incubation is easy. It's all about scaling, and I don't think that's the message. But scaling is kind of what matters, right? Everything else. ideation is low risk. Right? Yeah. That's why we spend so much time there. It's a trap, right? It's low risk. Incubation, I think probably the biggest corporate failure is moving out of incubation too soon, right? Spending too soon and it crashes too soon. And then scaling is hardest. And for me, scaling is about how do you assemble the assets, right? And you think about how most startups get an exit. Certainly in the United States, the most common startup exit by far is acquisition by a corporation. Right? That's how they scale, right? Why? Right? Well, because corporates have assets. They have customers, channels, relationships. They have capabilities to do with product, to do with technology, maybe to do with manufacturing. And then they have capacity. They have large manufacturing facilities. They might have call centers. They might have a sales team. But there's ability to do something for more and more people, more and more audiences, right? And so your ability to pull these three levers in different ways. And some of it is to do with how you leverage the assets you've got, right? And I think that is the key thing for a corporation. How do I leverage what I've already got? But some of it you're going to buy. You are going to want to acquire either a startup or some more mature asset, but you do it because you're driving towards an ambition. You don't do it and imagine it's the solution of itself. Right? That's the flaw of the M&A story. And actually, Craig Christensen did some research a decade or two ago where he looked at what happens when firms buy radical innovation. Right? You spend too much, get too much, too little back. That's the story, right? And so, but if you add an asset like the LexisNexis story, they bought this fairly large firm, ChoicePoint, and they bought it for the data that it had, right? And when I talked to the people who were in ChoicePoint when it was acquired, they're like, from day one, they had a mission with us. They knew exactly how they were integrating us into their business in order to achieve a goal, right? And that's what scaling is all about. Now, you've still got to leave it separate, right? Because it's still got a little bit more dynamic. It's not mature at this point. It's going to work at a different clock speed still than the traditional core business in most cases. But even that isn't one story. We tell the story of Deloitte Pixel. This is the crowdsourcing of labor in Deloitte, it's a story which has moved forward enormously since we wrote the book. And my colleague Mike has done another case on that. And it's a story of getting closer to the core because they want to leverage the existing client relationships, right? Yeah. So it's never one exact story as to how you set up the structure to scale, but it's always about how do you get the assets to achieve an ambition. That's the key message in this. And we should also talk some about, you had Ron Adner on, and so Ron's whole thinking about what's the adoption chain in an industry is key here as well, because that tells you a lot about what partnerships you need, what acquisitions you need in order to reduce the risks that accumulate through an ecosystem.
Okay. Oh, and so to briefly go back to your structural ambidexterity solution. So I'm just curious. So if you work together with companies in your consulting activities or just maybe even in executive teaching or whatever, if you have discussions with these executives that try to do structural ambidexterity, what do they see as the core challenge in implementing it? Where do they struggle with this notion of structural ambidexterity?
They struggle mostly in two areas, I find. One is relationships. Is how do you understand what one another are doing well enough to be there to help when you need it?
Yeah.
And so you need some structures, some mechanisms for keeping the core business engaged, not so that they have control and also not so that they waste their time, but enough so that they are involved in the story. So kind of scaling begins at ideation in a way, right? They have to have enough involvement, just like a VC investor that doesn't just come in at the end and understand everything you've done. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
The second thing is metrics. right? And this is really a challenge, without question, because a more mature organization has a disciplined approach to understanding its metrics and its KPIs and all this kind of stuff, and its steering mechanism. But a less mature asset, you're going to manage it in different ways. And one of the ways that I think we talk about this in the book, we like to think about this is the difference between feedback and feed forward, right? Feedback metric is error control. I'm doing this, I get a result. How do I, and it's not the result I want, how do I find out how to correct and get a different result? And you can do that where you have performance information, you have market information, you've done it before, you can compare it to other tactics and outcomes. And so revenue and profit and yield and all of these kinds of outcome measures are appropriate. But feed forward is about, am I getting to my goal? Am I getting to my ambition? What have I learned that tells me have I validated or invalidated my hypotheses, right? So there's much more about anticipatory metrics, which is a much harder thing, and feels, unless you prepared the ground, it feels like fluff to the core business, right? And this is one of the reasons they hate the explorers sometimes, is because they feel like, basically their question is, what are you doing with my money? It's not an unreasonable question. And I would argue that at some points the venture builders will face this question as well, right? What are you doing with my money? Unless you can provide evidence and a track that shows them that you're being disciplined and accountable for your outcomes, and it's not just a free-for-all. Right. That's then so I think relationships metrics, this is where people mostly struggle. The structural part of how do you set it up and arrange it? Yeah, there's some difficulties. How to deal with sales is always a challenge. But these are the fundamental. There's also a question of incentives we can talk about too, though I think we spent too much time on that, to be honest.
Yeah.
I was just, I like to put these things into context. And one of the topics, being here in Germany, I think one of the topics that is still front and center in the corporate world is the massive transformation in the automotive industry in recent years. There's some of the most iconic German brands were working on EVs for decades and have pumped billions and billions of euros into tackling that challenge. Here comes along a young challenger out of California and literally takes over and dominates the market, becomes the most valuable, at least on paper, the most valuable car company in the world. I mean, you looking at an example like that, is that just an issue of short-sightedness? Is it an issue of pace? Is it because these companies lack that ambidexterity? Was it the wrong leadership in place? Like, you've seen enough companies. Are there some red flags that you need to look out for companies that are like, okay, you're in deep shit if you don't make massive change?
I think yes, and I think that whenever you're in a position where your profits are really strong and mature, and you've got that vulnerability. Then, if you look at the way leadership behave, right, and for me, the auto industry has always been more interested in itself. It's very proud of itself, right, and so I remember. I have to speak carefully because I do have auto industry clients. But I went to one who's not currently a client in Europe, we shall say, and they explained their new model release strategy, which was, we bring all of the new cars to a weekend with the management board, and they decide which ones they like best. Right. So and indeed, the American auto company I work with, which I'm possibly fond of the people, there's nothing they like about talking about more than their muscle cars. Mm-hmm. Right. And so they have become obsessed with themselves rather than with the customer. Right. And they've been dislocated from the customer by dealership networks and all the rest of it. But guess what? we don't get a pass just because this is the structure of the industry. And that's why expectations, right? Culture has been determined in this way. You've got to get the story and start understanding that this is about how you learn about your customers, how you trigger a response in them that says, these guys really want to solve the problems I've got, right? I'm really interested in what they've got to do for me, in the way that people have that reaction to Tesla. And so I think that this is the piece. Are you obsessed with yourself rather than your customers? And then, is the pace of change inside the company slower than the pace of change outside? And if you are in anywhere in Germany in the auto industry, you've got to say, for the most part, yes, yes, yes. I think Mercedes is a little different. I think they played with a few things, and I think they made some mistakes, but I think they've had some successes. But the rest of them, you've got to wonder what they've been doing. And I'll tell you, as somebody who's driven a BMW for as long as I could afford one, I am pissed that they have still not got a vehicle for me to buy, right? So as a customer, I'm like, if I didn't dislike Elon Musk so much, I would have bought a Tesla long ago.
So, I mean, it sounds to me a lot similar to what Ron Adner was talking about, is this ecosystem trap, right? Like, looking inward, taking this kind of Ptolemaic view.
Why didn't they call that book the egocentric ecosystem? It's such a dumb title to his book. I mean, it's such a brilliant book. What is this title about? Ron? I don't know, but
awesome.
That is a beautiful phrase. The ego system. It exactly captures, and anybody who's worked in platforms, and we did some stuff with Ron with a client, knows that every company you come across, they all conceive of themselves at the center of this ecosystem. And you're like, guys, why? Right? And it's the same phenomenon. You're exactly right. Exactly right.
Awesome.
Well, I think we've come to a time where we wrap things up, bringing it back to our guest with a few more insights, not just into all the things you've studied and learned over your career, but maybe some of the learnings that you've had as an individual. So same three questions we ask all guests. I'm guessing all three, like most people dislike them, but you're going to get them anyway. So first one is imparting a little bit of wisdom. So what advice would you have for your younger self that you have learned throughout your career that you wish you had known back then?
Yeah, that's always like an alarming question, isn't it? I would say curiosity. I think be even more curious. I thought I was curious, but I was nowhere near curious enough. Because if I'd been more curious, I would have learned things that I can now say, oh, I had exposure to this, right? And I could have learned about it earlier. I think that. So that would definitely be a part of it, because it's a little egocentrism as well, right? We imagine ourselves at the center of the universe, whereas in reality the world is so much more diverse and complex than that, and so everything we think or experience is related to somebody else, and somebody else is doing things, and it's about being able to learn how the dots connect early in our lives, and also I think not conceive of ourselves as being right too much. But then the second one would be not let all of that curiosity and humility, I hope, get in the way of moving faster. I certainly am somebody who should have moved faster on a couple of things. For example, the day that I spoke to one of my case studies in the book, Jensen Huang at NVIDIA in 2015, and he laid out what they were doing at NVIDIA. And between then and when we published the book, the share price went up 8,500%. And I bought no stock in this company. So definitely move faster and act with confidence, because at least you learn. And if you never act, you don't learn. And there's some things where I really feel that was the case.
Yeah, it's great wisdom. All right, two more quick questions. I've always believed one can learn much about a person by what they read. What do you have a book on your bedside table or a recent read that you would recommend?
I'd have two. So on my bedside table is Murakami's Norwegian Wood. I went to Japan earlier this month, with a bunch of companies there, and so I wanted to get myself in tune with Japan, and I just love the way he blends psychology and reality. He's just kind of like amazingly. I find every book of his is a discovery, and I hadn't read this one. And the other one I'm going to say is Both and Thinking, by my friend and co-author on some articles, Wendy Smith. And the reason I mention it is because it actually is a great companion to what we're talking about, because what she and her colleague Marianne Lewis are talking about is that we get trapped in either or thinking, and we this is almost always limiting the options that are possible to us, and just as we think that entrepreneurs are great and startups are good, and that venture building is going to generate value, you can have both that, and corporations do beat startups at innovation, which is the subtitle of our book. So I think I'd recommend it highly.
Awesome. Last question, Andy. What's cycling on your playlist when you're going for a workout, at the gym, driving a road trip? What are you listening to?
So musically, I alternate between Beethoven string quartets and Scarlatti piano sonatas. So because I find that Scarlatti somehow managed to get the exact wavelength of my brain patterns, and so that I can think more clearly when I'm listening to Scarlatti. In terms of what I'm listening to the car right now, I'm listening to this awesome podcast called Who Killed Daphne, by Stephen Gray, and it's this terrifying story of the journalist in Malta who was murdered in 2017 or early 18, and the political corruption that led to this. And he kind of tells this real-time whodunit story, and he's sharing audio clips from when he was in Malta researching it, and it's hair-raising stuff. So and it's one of those things where you're just comforted that he's going to survive, because he's published the podcast. He must make it through, right? But it's fun stuff.
Wow. I mean, the binaural beats you're getting from Scarlatti versus murder stories, that couldn't be any more different psychologically, I think. Awesome. Andy, thank you so much. What an absolute treat to have you on the podcast. Really a thought-provoking conversation. Definitely some things that I'm going to take back and reflect on in my work. I'm sure Dries the same, but thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'd love to get feedback and challenge and ideas. I'm just constantly wanting to learn and to understand, more about this great animal of corporate innovation.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, folks, that was Andy Binns, author, advisor, and innovation guru extraordinaire. To learn more about Andy's work, check out his websites, changelogic.com, and you can learn more about one of his seminal works at thecorporateexplorer.com. We'll be sure to put those in the show notes. Of course, please stay tuned for more exciting episodes in the coming weeks. And until then, if you like the show, be sure to follow us and provide a 5-star review on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast streaming service. Bis nächstes Mal.